Do you remember those old, heavy history textbooks we grew up with? The faded pictures of Greek temples and Roman legions. Do you remember the chapter on Africa? It was usually short. Maybe some jungles, some pyramids in Egypt, carefully separated from the rest of the continent. But what if I told you that while Europe was still in its dark ages, a black queen commanded an army so feared? Even Alexander the Great decided not to invade. Her story and countless others wasn't just lost, it was erased, on purpose. Tonight, we're going to find those stories and tell the truth. The world they taught us. Think back with me for a minute. Picture yourself in your old classroom. Remember the smell of the floor wax and the wooden desks? The sound of the big clock on the wall. Tick, tick, tick. And remember those heavy history books? The ones with the glossy pictures of Roman senators in togas and knights in shining armor. We learned about the cradle of civilization in Mesopotamia. We learned about the philosophies of Greece, the power of the Roman Empire, the Renaissance in Europe. That was history. And then there was a chapter on Africa. What do you remember seeing? For me, it was mostly maps of jungles. Maybe a mention of the Nile, but Egypt was always treated like it was somewhere in the Mediterranean, not really a part of Africa. The rest of the continent? It was called the Dark Continent. It was a place of Tarzan and safaris, a place we were taught of primitive tribes waiting to be discovered. That was the story. That was the only story we were given, and it was a simple story. It was, in a way, a comfortable story. It reinforced everything we saw in the world around us, that civilization flowed from Europe, and everywhere else was just waiting. But that story, that fog that settled over an entire continent, it wasn't an accident. It was a curtain that was deliberately pulled over one of the most powerful, brilliant, and absolutely staggering stories in all of human history. The Shock, a war on memory. Because here is the truth, the one that was kept from us. While many European ancestors were still living in mud huts, navigating tribal conflicts, African queens commanded armies of 120,000 soldiers. They controlled trade routes worth billions in today's money. While Rome was just figuring itself out, black civilizations were building pyramids. Not just in Egypt, but hundreds of them further south, in what is now Sudan. The story we were told wasn't just incomplete, it was a lie. And it was a lie told for a single, brutal purpose. You see, this wasn't an accident. It wasn't lost history. It was a war on memory. Think about it. How do you justify enslaving millions of people? How do you justify colonizing an entire continent, stripping it of its wealth, and claiming it's to their own good? You can't do it if they're your equals. You can't do it if they have a history of empires, of universities older than Oxford, of military geniuses who defeated Roman legions. No, you first have to make them less than human. You have to convince the world, and even convince them that they have no history, that they built nothing, ruled nothing, were nothing before you arrived. So the policy was simple. Erase it all. They burned the libraries, like the ones in Timbuktu, that held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts on science, law, and philosophy. They melted down the priceless gold artifacts. They demolished the temples. And when they found something they couldn't destroy, like the magnificent stone cities of Great Zimbabwe, they just lied. They said, "Oh, Africans couldn't have built this. It must have been anyone else." They waged a war on memory. But the truth has a funny way of surviving. It survives in the stories whispered from mother to daughter. It survives in the ruins they couldn't find. And it survives in the records of their enemies, who wrote down in awe and in fear what they saw. Tonight, we're going to meet the women they tried to bury. Let's start with a queen whose wealth and wisdom was so great. It's even in the Bible. though they conveniently left out the most important parts. The diplomat queen, Makeda of Sheba. Her name was Makeda. We know her better as the Queen of Sheba. Now, the story most of us heard in Sunday school is about her visiting King Solomon to test his wisdom. It's a nice story, but it's not the whole story. Let's paint the real picture. This was not a social call. This was a diplomatic mission between two superpowers. Makeda ruled a kingdom that spanned modern-day Ethiopia and Yemen, and she controlled something that, in the ancient world, was worth more than gold, frankincense and myrrh. If you only hear those words in Christmas carols, let's be clear, this was the oil of its day. It was the scent of every religious ceremony, the core of medicine, the base of perfume. It was power, and she controlled the supply. So when Makeda traveled to Jerusalem, she wasn't coming as a student. She was coming as an equal, a head of state. She was coming to assess this rising king, Solomon, to see if an alliance made sense, to negotiate trade routes, and to make it clear who she was. The Bible says she arrived with a very great retinue, with camels bearing spices, and very much gold and precious stones. That's not a tourist. That's a power play. According to Ethiopian tradition, their meeting of minds was so profound that they had a son, Menelik, who would become the first emperor of Ethiopia, establishing a dynasty that ruled for 3,000 years. 3,000 years. But here's where the eraser comes out. For centuries, European scholars just couldn't accept it. A black queen from Africa, possessing that much wealth, that much intelligence, negotiating as an equal with their biblical hero? Impossible. So they insisted she must have been Arab, or from somewhere in the Middle East. They literally redrew maps in their minds and in their books to avoid giving credit where it was due, because acknowledging that a black African queen ruled one of the ancient world's wealthiest kingdoms, well, that would contradict the whole story they were trying to build, wouldn't it? Makeda was an economic powerhouse, but the queen we're meeting next, she was a military storm, and she was about to do something no one thought possible. She was about to defeat the Roman Empire, the undefeated general, Amanirenas of Kush. So, let's jump forward in time to about 40 BCE. The Roman Empire is at its absolute height. This is the Rome of movies. Caesar Augustus is the first emperor, and his legions are the most terrifying military force the world has ever seen. They are invincible. They're expanding in every direction, and everyone bows to Rome. After they conquer Egypt, they turn their eyes south to the ancient kingdom of Kush in what's now Sudan. They saw it as just the next piece of property, and they did what Rome always did. They tried to impose taxes. Queen Amanirenas, the ruler of Kush, gave them an answer they were not expecting. She wasn't just a queen. She was a general. The Romans would later write about her with a mix of shock and grudging respect, calling her the one-eyed queen, as she had lost an eye in a previous battle. She didn't send a letter. She raised an army of 30,000 soldiers, marched north, and sacked 3 Roman forts. But she didn't just defeat them. She sent a message. She tore down the statues of Emperor Augustus, and she took a single bronze head of the emperor, brought it back to her capital, and had it buried under the steps of a temple dedicated to her gods. Think about that. The sheer, calculated defiance. She made it so every single person who entered the temple would, for eternity, walk over the face of the Roman emperor. Well, Rome was furious. This just didn't happen. They sent 10,000 of their best legionnaires south to crush this rebellion. And what happened? Amanirenas, this one-eyed warrior queen, fought them to a standstill. For 5 years, she held off the greatest military machine in the ancient world. She used guerrilla tactics, Superior knowledge of the terrain. She used tactical brilliance that the Romans just couldn't counter. The war became too expensive, too bloody, too humiliating for Rome. And so, the Roman Empire, the empire that supposedly never surrendered, did the unthinkable. They negotiated a peace treaty. They agreed to pull their troops out of her territory. They agreed to exempt Kush from all taxes. They let her kingdom remain independent. Let that sink in for a second. A black African queen defeated the Roman Empire, not in a myth, not in a legend, in documented historical fact. Roman historians wrote about it. Archaeologists found that bronze head, right where the story said it was, under the temple steps. So why isn't this in every history book? Why don't we have movies about her? Because it shatters the whole myth. The myth of Roman invincibility. The myth of Western superiority. The story of a black woman general who told the world's greatest power no, and made it stick. That story just didn't fit the narrative they were building. And this pattern of demonizing or erasing powerful women, it only gets worse. Let's fast forward 1,600 years to a queen who would fight her entire life against an even more sinister enemy, the unbreakable stateswoman, Nzinga of Angola. Now we go forward to the 1620s. We're in the kingdom of Ndongo, in modern-day Angola. And the enemy is different. It's not just about taxes or a territory anymore. This is a new kind of evil. The Portuguese have arrived, and they are there for one reason: the hunt for human beings, to fuel the transatlantic slave trade that would devastate the continent for centuries. And they've just met the person who is going to make their lives an absolute nightmare for the next 30 years. Her name is Nzinga. There is a story about her that tells you everything you need to know. When she first went to negotiate a treaty with the Portuguese governor, he decided to try a petty, humiliating power move. He sat in his velvet, elevated chair, and in the middle of the room, he had a mat placed on the floor for her. The message was clear. You are a savage. You are beneath me. You will sit on the floor and look up at me. The room goes silent. Nzinga doesn't flinch. She doesn't say a word. She simply gestures to one of her attendants. The woman immediately walks to the center of the room, gets down on her hands and knees, and becomes a human throne. Nzinga sits on her servant's back. Now, she is perfectly eye level with the governor, and from that position, she looks him in the eye and begins a negotiation. She didn't just refuse the disrespect. She turned it back on him. She showed him, without a single word, I am the power in this room. My people are my throne. This is who the Portuguese were dealing with. And when she took the throne, she proved to be a military and political genius. She understood European politics better than they understood her. She brilliantly played the Portuguese off against their rivals, the Dutch. She offered sanctuary to escaped slaves, building her army with people who had every reason to fight. For 30 years, a lifetime, she led troops into battle herself. Well into her 60s, she fought, she negotiated, she retreated, she attacked. She refused every attempt to break her. When she died at age 80, she died undefeated, having saved thousands of her people. So, how did history remember her? How did the Portuguese records describe this brilliant, unbreakable stateswoman? They called her a witch, a savage, a bloodthirsty demon. Of course they did. It's the same tired old story. They couldn't stand the truth. They couldn't admit in their own history books that they were being outfought, outmaneuvered, and outsmarted for 3 decades by a black woman. But here's the most important part. Nzinga was an anomaly. She wasn't a one in a million. She was a product of a culture where powerful women were not the exception. They were the rule. The cultural foundation, the Candakes and Amina. Because here's the thing, Nzinga, Amanirenas, Makeda, they weren't exceptions. They weren't anomalies. They were the products of sophisticated societies where women holding ultimate power was not a fairy tale. In the kingdom of Kush, the same one where Amanirenas ruled, they had a specific word for this, Candake. In Greek, it became Candace. It didn't just mean queen. It meant warrior queen, a ruler who commanded armies, who ruled in her own right, without a king telling her what to do. There was an entire dynasty of them. Their reputation was so formidable that when Alexander the Great was conquering everything in his path, from Greece to India, he reached the borders of Nubia, and he stopped. Ancient writers tell us he heard about the Candakes and their armies, and he decided that fight just wasn't worth it. Think about that. Alexander the Great hesitated. These are the same people who built those hundreds of other pyramids in Sudan, the ones nobody talks about. That's the culture they came from. Or let's go to West Africa, to what's now Nigeria, in the 1500s. Let's talk about Queen Amina of Zazzau. Amina came to power in a kingdom that sat on the crucial trans-Saharan trade routes, the highways of African commerce. Gold, salt, ivory. Unimaginable wealth flowed along these routes. Amina decided she wanted to control them all. She was a brilliant military strategist. She took personal command of her army of 20,000 soldiers and began expanding her territory. Everywhere she conquered, she built massive, fortified earthen walls around the cities, some of which are still standing today. She ruled for 34 years and turned her kingdom into one of the wealthiest in all of West Africa. So, when British colonizers arrived centuries later and heard the oral histories, the detailed stories about this powerful queen, what did they do? You already know, don't you? They dismissed her as a myth. They said it was just folklore. An African queen leading armies? Building walls? Impossible. It was the same pattern over and over. When they found the ruins of Great Zimbabwe, a staggering stone city, they insisted anyone else must have built it. Phoenicians, Arabs, even aliens. Anyone but the black Africans whose ancestors had clearly created it. Because to admit any of this, to admit that these queens were not exceptions, but were part of a culture of power, brilliance, and civilization, that would have shattered the entire justification for their civilizing mission. And the proof was everywhere. It still is. The proof they couldn't bury. You see, the truth always leaves a trace. No matter how hard they try to burn it, bury it, or lie about it, the proof was always there, waiting. Remember Queen Amanirenas? And the bronze head of Emperor Augustus she buried under the temple steps? In 1910, archaeologists were digging in the ruins of her ancient capital, and there it was, pulled from the sand, perfectly preserved, right where the oral histories, the stories passed down for 2,000 years, said it would be, the truth, waiting right under their feet. And when those first European explorers did finally reach West Africa in the 1400s and 1500s, before the war on memory was in full swing, they were dazzled. They didn't find primitive tribes. They found the Mali Empire, an empire larger than Western Europe, with a GDP that dwarfed anything in medieval England or France. They found its emperor, Mansa Musa, a black man who was so fabulously wealthy, so rich, that when he went on his pilgrimage to Mecca, he gave away so much gold along the way that he literally crashed the entire Mediterranean economy for a decade. He was, quite possibly, the richest human being who ever lived. They found Timbuktu, not a mythical, faraway place, but a bustling city with universities older than Harvard and Yale, where scholars from around the world came to study mathematics, astronomy, law, and medicine. They found the artists of Benin, who were casting bronze sculptures with technical sophistication that European artists wouldn't figure out for another 400 years. It was so advanced, they just assumed it must have been imported. They found all of this. They wrote about it. They marveled at it. And then, when the time came to justify slavery and colonization, they, and the generations that followed them, conveniently forgot. They hid the proof. They suppressed the reports. They locked away the art. Because this truth, the truth of these queens, these emperors, these universities, and this wealth, this truth proves that the lie they built our modern world on was a lie. So why does this matter now? Why does a history from 300 or 3,000 years ago mean anything to us today? Greatness is your inheritance. Why does this matter? Why does a 3,000-year-old story about a queen of Kush or a 400-year-old battle in Angola mean anything to you and me today? Because erasing a people's past is how you control their future. If you can be convinced that your ancestors were nothing, that they built nothing, ruled nothing, then you might believe that you are destined for nothing. You might accept subjugation as natural. You might believe the lie that you are inherently inferior. You might not fight for the power that is and always has been your birthright. The most revolutionary act, it turns out, is simply to remember. It's refusing to accept the sanitized, whitewashed version of history they handed us. It's digging up the stories they try to bury and shouting them so loud that they can never be ignored again. These 5 queens, Makeda, Amanirenas, Nzinga, Amina, and the Kandakes, they weren't just lost history. They are a testament. They are the proof that the current world order, the one built on a lie of European superiority, was never natural, and it is not inevitable. It was a construct built on violence, built on theft, and built on that war on memory. This is our real history. It's not just black history. It's human history, and it was stolen from all of us. Remembering them isn't just about correcting a textbook. It's about understanding that the power, the brilliance, the resilience, the genius that built those empires and defeated those armies, that didn't go anywhere. It's in the DNA. It's in the oral histories. It's in the spirit of every person descended from those civilizations. They didn't fight their wars, build their pyramids, and rule their kingdoms just so their descendants would believe the lies of their conquerors. They did it so we would know, so we would remember, so that we would understand. That greatness is our inheritance.